I'm watching something extraordinary unfold in real time. Not just the arrest of a sitting head of state, not just a military operation that crossed sovereign borders, but something far more revealing about how narrative control works when the stakes are existential. Mike Waltz, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, just delivered what the media is calling a chilling warning about Venezuela's Nicolás Maduro. But what I'm tracking isn't the warning itself. It's the mechanism behind it, the framing, the escalation ladder being built, piece by piece, in public statements that sound defensive but function as something else entirely. Here's the line everyone's repeating: "These aren't your grandfather's mafia." Waltz said it on Fox News Sunday Morning Futures, defending the U.S. military operation that seized Maduro from Caracas and flew him to New York to face narco-terrorism charges. The phrase landed clean, quotable, designed to stick. But let me show you what's underneath it. Because this isn't a sound bite, it's a reframe. And the reframe matters more than the operation itself. Start with the receipts. On January 3, 2026, U.S. forces conducted what the Justice Department describes as a large-scale operation inside Venezuela. They captured Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, both now facing federal charges in the Southern District of New York. The indictment, unsealed by Attorney General Pam Bondi, accuses Maduro of running a 25-year narco-terrorism conspiracy that imported thousands of tons of cocaine into the United States. According to publicly available court documents, the operation involved the Cartel de los Soles, a Venezuelan state-backed cartel, and Tren de Aragua, a transnational criminal organization now operating inside U.S. borders. Maduro's own son, his interior minister, Diosdado Cabello, and key cartel leaders are named as co-defendants. Now here's where the narrative diverges from standard law enforcement. Waltz didn't just defend the arrest, he escalated the threat classification. In his UN remarks and his Fox interview, he explicitly compared Tren de Aragua and Cartel de los Soles to ISIS and al-Qaeda, not metaphorically, structurally. He said these groups are more like ISIS and al-Qaeda with state backing than traditional organized crime. That's not a description. That's a designation. And designation unlocks an entirely different toolkit. Traditional mafia, that's RICO statutes, extradition treaties, judicial process, but terrorist organizations with state sponsors, that's Article 51 of the UN Charter. That's the inherent right to self-defense. That's the legal architecture that justifies preemptive strikes, cross-border operations, and what Waltz called decisive action. The grandfather's mafia line isn't color commentary, it's a legal threshold, and once you cross it, sovereignty becomes negotiable. Here's the detail they're not emphasizing in the coverage. The U.S. has been building this case since 2020, during Trump's first term. Maduro was already under federal indictment. The U.S. had already placed a $50 million bounty on him, doubled in August 2025. But an indictment doesn't justify a military raid on a sovereign capital. So the frame had to shift. From fugitive drug lord to narco-terrorist with state backing coordinating with hostile powers. And that's where Waltz's warning gets surgical. In his UN Security Council remarks, Waltz laid out the connections methodically. According to his statement, Maduro's regime openly cooperates with Iran's military apparatus, hosts Hezbollah operatives, partners with Russian and Chinese intelligence services, and coordinates with Cuban state security. He framed Venezuela not as a rogue state, but as a node in a hostile network. A network that, in his words, is pumping drugs, thugs, and weapons into the United States of America. Notice the language. Drugs, thugs, weapons, not migrants, not refugees, thugs. That's threat inflation, and it's doing work. But the timeline doesn't match the urgency. If Maduro has been operating this network for 25 years, why now? Why this weekend? Waltz's answer is revealing. He said Trump gave diplomacy a chance and gave Maduro a chance, but ultimately took decisive action in the interests of the United States. That's post hoc justification. The operation wasn't reactive. It was scheduled. The superseding indictment was filed under seal just before Christmas 2024. The strikes on Venezuelan oil tankers escalated throughout December. The military assets were already in position. This wasn't a last resort. This was a rollout. And here's where the narrative mechanics get visible. Venezuela immediately requested an emergency UN Security Council meeting scheduled for Monday morning. Their ambassador, Samuel Moncada, called the operation a colonial war aimed at destroying destroying our Republican form of government and accused the U.S. of violating Article 2 of the UN Charter, which prohibits the use of force against territorial integrity. Waltz's response was ready before the question was asked. He said the Security Council will hear a lot of hand-wringing about sovereignty, but he'll remind them of Article 51, self-defense. Frame, counterframe, preloaded. The incentive structure here is layered. Domestically, Trump campaigned on ending endless wars and bringing troops home. A quick, clean operation that removes a designated narco-terrorist and positions the U.S. as protector of the hemisphere plays well with his base. It also sidesteps the Afghanistan comparison. No drawn-out occupation. Trump himself said the U.S. will run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. Temporary. Transitional, not regime change. That's the language, even as U.S. forces control Caracas. Internationally, this sends a signal to every state in the hemisphere. The Maduro precedent, as some legal scholars are already calling it, establishes that sovereignty can be overridden if a sitting leader is indicted in U.S. courts and designated as a terrorist sponsor. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum reportedly called an emergency cabinet meeting after the arrest, with sources describing panic in Mexico City. Trump didn't ease those concerns. He told reporters, "Cartels control Mexico. Something is going to have to be done with Mexico now." Not subtle, not ambiguous, a warning dressed as a statement of fact. Russia, China, and several South American governments condemned the operation immediately. Russia's foreign ministry called it a flagrant violation of international law. China backed Venezuela's request for the Security Council meeting. But here's what I'm tracking. Their condemnation is verbal, not operational. No troop movements, no economic sanctions, no countermeasures beyond diplomatic theater. They're watching the same thing everyone else is watching, a stress test of the international system. And so far, the system is absorbing it. To be fair, and this is where we apply the fairness layer, there is a legitimate case to be made that Maduro's government does pose a measurable threat to U.S. security. The indictment alleges that up to 250 tons of cocaine per year moved through Venezuela by 2020, facilitated by state infrastructure. Tren de Aragua has been linked to violent crimes in multiple U.S. cities, including kidnappings and murders. The group operates with apparent impunity in Venezuela, suggesting at minimum state tolerance, at maximum state coordination. If those facts are verified in court, and they will be tested in the Southern District of New York under Judge Alvin Hellerstein, then Waltz's framing has evidentiary support. The strongest argument on the other side isn't that Maduro is innocent. It's that unilateral military action sets a precedent that erodes the entire framework of international law. If the U.S. can designate a leader as a terrorist, issue an indictment, and then conduct a military raid to enforce that indictment, what stops China from doing the same to Taiwan's president? What stops Russia from applying identical logic to Ukraine's leadership? What stops any nuclear power from redefining sovereignty as conditional, subject to their judicial interpretation of threat? UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres already flagged this. He called the operation a dangerous precedent, not illegal, dangerous. That word choice matters. He's not challenging the U.S. directly. He's signaling concern about second-order effects, about what happens when this becomes normalized. And this is where the escalation gets visible. Trump didn't just arrest Maduro, he announced the U.S. will run Venezuela. Temporarily, he says, until a safe transition. But who defines safe? Who defines the timeline? And what happens if the transition takes years? We've seen this movie before. Iraq 2003, Libya 2011. The rhetoric of liberation followed by the reality of occupation. Trump's base wants him to avoid exactly that trap. But the logic of the operation pulls toward it. You don't deploy military assets to Caracas, arrest a head of state, and then walk away in 6 months. The commitments compound. Here's the mechanism I'm watching most closely. The media coverage is splitting along predictable lines. Conservative outlets are framing this as decisive leadership, a blow against narco-terrorism, a reassertion of American strength. Progressive outlets are calling it illegal aggression, imperialism, a violation of sovereignty. But both narratives miss what's actually happening. This isn't about Maduro. This is about the threshold, about whether a designation, terrorist or otherwise, can override sovereignty, and whether U.S. courts can issue binding warrants that justify military enforcement across borders. Waltz's grandfather's mafia line is doing critical work in that threshold debate. By framing these cartels as terrorist organizations, not criminal enterprises, he shifts the legal and rhetorical terrain. Mafia bosses get arrested by the FBI. Terrorists get targeted by the military. The grandfather's mafia operated in shadows, bribed judges, ran protection rackets, but they didn't coordinate with hostile foreign powers. They didn't operate as state-backed entities. That's the distinction Waltz is drawing, and it's the distinction that makes the operation defensible under Article 51. But here's the detail that complicates the narrative. The indictment against Maduro includes charges from actions dating back to 2004 when he was foreign minister, not president. Some of the alleged cocaine shipments occurred under Hugo Chavez's administration. The case isn't just about current threats. It's about historical accountability. And that raises a question. If the U.S. can reach back 20 years to indict and arrest a sitting president for actions committed as a lower official, what's the statute of limitations on sovereignty? Venezuela isn't Iraq. It has oil reserves, yes, but it also has regional alliances, proximity to the U.S., and a population that's been under sanctions for years. The humanitarian situation is already severe. A prolonged U.S. presence could stabilize or destabilize depending on execution. And execution is where these operations historically fail, not in the first 72 hours, in the first 72 days, when the initial victory narrative fades and the administrative reality sets in. Waltz is heading into the UN Security Council meeting Monday with a prepared script. He'll cite Article 51. He'll present the indictment as evidence. He'll frame the operation as self-defense against a narco-terrorist threat. Russia and China will cite Article 2, condemn the violation of sovereignty, and call for Maduro's release. Neither side will persuade the other, but that's not the goal. The goal is to establish competing legal narratives that justify future actions. Russia wants to preserve the principle that sovereignty is absolute. The U.S. wants to establish that sovereignty is conditional, revocable when a state sponsors terrorism. And here's where the second-order effects get serious. If this precedent holds, if the international community absorbs the Maduro operation without meaningful consequences, then the threshold moves permanently. Other nations will test it, not immediately, but within the next 24 months, we'll see parallel operations, different actors, different targets, same legal architecture. The Maduro precedent becomes the sovereignty exception. And once that exception exists, the system doesn't return to the prior equilibrium. The financial markets are already pricing this in. Venezuelan bonds rallied briefly on speculation of regime change and debt restructuring. Oil futures spiked on fears of supply disruption, then stabilized when it became clear the U.S. would maintain production. But the real repricing is happening in geopolitical risk assessment. Every government with a contentious relationship with the U.S. or China or Russia is now recalculating what sovereignty means in practice, not in theory, in practice. Mike Waltz's warning wasn't just about Maduro, it was about the framework, about signaling that the rules have changed, even if the language stays the same. Not your grandfather's mafia means not your grandfather's international system. It means the post-World War II consensus, the UN Charter framework, the assumption that borders matter and sovereignty is inviolable. Those assumptions are now conditional, subject to revision, subject to enforcement. And that brings us to the one question nobody's asking out loud, but everyone's calculating in private. If the narrative needs this much legal architecture, this much rhetorical escalation, this much framing and counterframing to justify a single arrest, what happens when the next arrest requires even more? What happens when the threshold keeps moving and the precedents keep stacking and the exceptions swallow the rule? Because I'm not watching a one-time operation. I'm watching a proof of concept. And the concept being tested isn't whether the U.S. can arrest Maduro, it's whether the international system can survive the erosion of its foundational principle. That sovereignty, however flawed, however abused, is the firewall that prevents permanent escalation. And once that firewall fails, we're not in your grandfather's world order anymore. We're in something new, something untested. And the question isn't whether it's justified, the question is whether it's stable. And right now, I'm not seeing evidence that anyone actually knows the answer.